Hello everyone, my name is Aervosa, and welcome to this ridiculously long analysis of the Doom the Dark Ages trailer. And the glorious day that I actually finally finished the script for this video because it turned out much longer than I thought it would. Now, as a note for throughout the video, I am definitely going to be reading off said script because I am not going to remember all of these facts and research pieces off the top of my head. So if I'm looking down and back up at the camera a lot, that is what I am doing. So on the agenda for today, we are going to be breaking down all the details I noticed in the trailer for Doom the Dark Ages, which is the newest game announced by id Software, planned to be released sometime next year in 2025. We're going to see exactly how medieval everything is, come up with some theories using lore as our foundation from the past games, as well as some observations we make looking through the trailer, and look at some very minute details that I found really interesting. Also, I've done my best not to repeat points other YouTubers have already made on the video, because I don't want to just go over things everyone already knows, so I'm going to try to stick with things that I think have either been missed or not really talked about yet on the internet. So settle in and let's go down some rabbit holes. Starting at the top with number 1, all of the font used in the trailer is the font Cantoria Pro Regular. In one of our first scenes, we see an Argent banner sitting slightly ajar surrounded by the carnage of a recent skirmish, which serves as our first callback to the Middle Ages. It's a variation on a heraldic flag called a gonfalon, which you might be familiar with from your local college graduation. In the Middle Ages, it was used for everything from ceremonies to religious processions to distinguishing who's who in battle. They also came in a variety of shapes and hung on a crossbar atop a pole so they could easily be seen above crowds. And they usually just contained images or large emblems, since most people during that time period were pretty illiterate. Now, Argent society is a little more advanced than most of medieval Europe, so our Doom Gonfalon has literally as much script as you could possibly fit on a single piece of fabric. We can see tons of ancient script going all the way down, almost like a walking proclamation of sorts, with the only image being this insignia here at the top. Now, it's pretty hard to make out unless you go frame by frame, so I've decided to take to Illustrator and do my best to recreate what this image actually is. We can see that there's a hammer and a pickaxe laid out in an X shape surrounded by beams of light, and in those beams we have an encircled mark of the Doomslayer and 2 other runes encircled on either side. I couldn't find these symbols in any other parts of the Doom games besides obviously the mark of the Slayer in the middle, and the hammer potentially being a callback to Commander Valen's hammer the Hellbreaker. So for now I think it's safe to say that this banner is going to be held by the marching forces of the Night Sentinels fighting alongside the Doomslayer, and hopefully we'll learn the meaning of all of this a little bit more as we go through the gameplay. Following the scene, we see a ship colliding with a turret, which looks to be a sentinel ship, just like the ones we saw in our battle on Amora. The central Colosseum is to our left, coming into full view in the next shot, and revealing more of the city and our first look into the gameplay and point number 3. Now, while much of the scene looks to be staged environmental effects, if we zoom in here to the bottom right, we can see a glowing box next to a wagon that's been set ablaze. As the scene plays out, it flashes twice, giving us a clear indication that it's an interactable element in the game and a potential loot box. I don't believe this would be a codex entry or a narrative-driven item, as Hugo Martin said in his interview with IGN that the story will be out of the codex and into the environment of the game itself. Thinking about what else this box could contain could really potentially change a lot about the gameplay for this next entry in the series. It's pretty out in the open and designed to be easily noticed by the player by its flashing material and placement on the causeway, so I don't believe it would be a collectible like a toy, vinyl, or cheat code of past entries, because those are usually pretty hidden. This might be serving as a visual replacement for ammo and armor. Now, this would be really interesting because in the past, players have always had the benefit of seeing exactly what resources are available to them in the environment, so they don't have to waste time in the potential of taking damage and high-stress battles that we've become accustomed to. So why would id choose to conceal resources to the player the same way you would go through and find things in like boxes and crates in Skyrim? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to just do it for aesthetics. We do have the shield saw, which we'll talk about later, which could potentially be used for ammo refills the same way the chainsaw was used in past entries, but we don't know that for certain yet. Guns, in my opinion, might be designed in this version to be used a little bit more sparingly and be a limited asset on the field. Looking at the super shotgun throughout the trailer, it seemed to do an unprecedented amount of damage to the Mancubus and the Hell Knight. Plus, we only see it used once in a scene, boasting a slow reload sequence. Same here with the rail spike gun. Now, the accelerator is a little faster, but still greatly slowed down and more intentional than the plasma rifle we're used to in Eternal in 2016. Hugo talked about in another interview, this time with GameSpot, how he really wanted the game to make you feel like either Leonidas in 300 or Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, who charge seemingly insurmountable amounts of enemies with unwavering confidence. He wants the players to have that same experience, just with the shotgun instead of a sword, where with one good swing we can fell our enemies. I think the gameplay might be leaving us more to our own devices to survive this war, hunting through the ravaged environments for supplies and maybe even health packs, with ammo a potentially scarce but significantly more powerful resource, leaving the player to think strategically and learn the new dance it has in store for us. The potential exception to this idea is the Skull Crusher, which many people, including myself, are very excited about. It fires way too fast to be a limited resource, but we'll save talking about it for later in the video. Other fun things of note in this scene is there's a sentinel statue here at the bottom, similar to the ones we see in Taras Nabad, and if we look closely at the corner of this ruin, it looks like the face of a crying old man, and now you can't unsee it either. Next up, let's take flight to point number 4, going to the floating city in the sky, or what Cloud City would look like from the Outer Rim if it took place in the Doom universe. There's a grand statue crowning the station's central tower, but whether or not this statue is a maker or a wraith, we're not quite sure yet. My money's on it being a maker facility though, due to the architecture of the building, along with the fact that this type of technology wasn't granted to the people of Argent and Nor until the time of Grief, when King Atrex agreed to have his people worship the makers in exchange for a better life and protection from the natural disasters around them. Additionally, the statue looks like a fusion of like maker angel heads, along with any maker we've seen with wings so far in the series. At this point in time, I think we're going to be starting the game just before the betrayal of the Order Daog during the Unholy Wars, which would make sense with this facility being a place where the priests and the makers equip the Doomslayer and other sentinels for battle under the guise of still being on their side. And on the note of equipping them for battle, we get to move on to point number 5 in our next scene, where we get to dive inside the facility and get our first look at the new Doomslayer's outfit. It boasts an air of legend and capability, with so many minute details and changes that give it a fantasy look. Let's break down what those details are, starting with my absolute favorite part, the giant, fluffy, Stoic the Vast Viking cape of the gods. And this cape is actually a little bit more Viking than I expected. I originally looked to see how animal furs were implemented during the Middle Ages, specifically in Europe, but I couldn't really find anything that matched what we were going for. Most people used more fine furs like ermine and squirrel in functional parts of their outfits to keep them warm. The closest thing I could find is moving forward a little bit in history in the gorgeous mantles that kings and emperors wore during the late Middle Ages, but these really aren't the vibe we're looking for and are a little too gaudy to wear into warfare, since these were mainly used just for ceremony. I ended up wading through countless images trying to find the epic hero cloak we're looking for, everything from fictional imaginings of days gone by to men just wearing a whole animal on their heads in German mythology. And I believe I found the only historical reference to someone actually wearing such a cape. It comes from the stories of King Harald Eriksson II, also known as Harald Grofell. Born in Norway in approximately 935, which was about halfway through the Middle Ages, Grofell was the son of Eric Bloodaxe and Gunhild Kongemar, the Mother of Kings, as well as nephew to King Harald Bluetooth. Yes, that Bluetooth. Now, during his lifetime, Grofell and his brothers led a campaign with the support of their uncle Bluetooth over many years to battle through modern-day Norway in an attempt to create their own kingdom. And with the eventual death of reigning King Håkon the Good in 961, they established themselves as the new kings of Norway. Over the course of his reign, Grofell took to conquering nearby rulers to expand his domain and established profitable trade routes, leading him one day to the docks of Hardanger, where he would acquire his namesake. Now, an old Icelandic poet by the name of Snorri Sturluson noted this story many years after the king's death, along with many other stories about the king's life. And in this particular section of the poem, the king encounters Icelandic merchants docked at port in Hardanger trying to sell Grofells. Now, a Grofell kind of imitates like the pelt of an animal, but in reality, it's sheep's wool that's been like woven together to make like a giant blanket, or sometimes they're used as cloaks or rugs, just trying to keep themselves warm during the very, very cold winters there in Norway. The merchants were having trouble trying to sell these cloaks, and when the king heard about this, he decided to take matter into his own hands to help out the situation. He went down to the docks himself and had one of his men buy him one of these coats, which he then decided to don as a cloak and walked down the dock in it, looking absolutely fabulous. Each one of his men also followed suit, purchasing one of the items from the Icelandic merchants, and as with any monarch donning a new piece of attire throughout history, this instantly became a smash hit, and very, very soon, all of the merchants' stock was completely sold out, thus giving the king his new nickname. As a note for historical transparency though, there's many other versions of where the king's nickname comes from. Some have offered up that Grofell in reality just means he was really good looking. Other people think that it really originated from the word grovverk. From what I found, people don't really know. The man did live hundreds of years ago, and even his birth year is a little fuzzy. A lot of details get lost to history when talking about these kinds of stories. For the sake of our video, which is fantasy based anyway, let's stick with Snorri's poem about the merchants and their cloaks. And here we can actually see what one of these cloaks looked like. This grofell was made on a loom following the weave pattern recorded from the time period, which shows the potential for the greyfell to be made just like the Slayers and Stoic the Vask's Viking cloaks. I think a black greyfell would be a perfect match for what we have going on here, with the raggy bottom, long rough texture, and just overall giant fluffy look. I also just really like the thought of Doomguy like wanting to like safely shear a sheep to make his beautiful big cloak rather than killing and skinning a fluffy animal because of how much he loves and misses his pet rabbit Daisy. This also makes sense for Stoic the Vast as well, as in their little Viking village, the only animal we ever see besides the dragons is the sheep. Though wearing a cape into battle was never done historically for practicality reasons.
Knock it!
Though it does look absolutely awesome with his new armor, and I absolutely love it. Moving on, let's take a look at the armor itself, starting with the chainmail. The pattern we can see here on his torso and his skirt looks to be a European 4-in-1 weave, which was standard for all historical mail in Europe from the late Middle Ages to the early modern period, so much so that all mail from antiquity is woven using the 4-in-1 pattern. Because of this, I think there's a pretty high possibility that most of the art references that id Software had at their disposal to make Doomguy's design was this 4-in-1 pattern. And I think they did a really good job with the design placements of the exposed sections and the front skirt throughout his armor. Also, I have to say it was unnecessarily difficult to really find the correct history of chainmail amongst all of the LARPing sites and just other fantasy things that people have out nowadays, mainly for one specific reason. It's not actually called chainmail. It's technically called mail or mail armor. Chainmail is what it's most commonly known by today, but that's really just kind of a variation of mail armor. Mail armor is the overarching parent term and derives from the old French word mail, which means mesh of a net. So, now you know. Or now I know. And to complement all of this mail, we have this little bit of material here underneath Doomguy's arm and visible on his forearms under his gauntlets. This is a protective medieval padding called an Agaddon. Now, an Agaddon is a quilted garment intended for wear under mail armor, which helped to guard against sword slashes and arrow punctures. These garments were made in a time-intensive process of weaving layers and layers of linen and or wool together. Now, this may sound kind of useless, but for the time it was a lot better than nothing. And if we take a look here at Shadiversity's and Todd's workshop videos, they do a really great job demonstrating its effectiveness. This was also a very difficult article of clothing to research because it's organic and decomposes and was made over 1,000 years ago, so we don't really have any physical evidence of it left besides like people writing about it or like illustrations of it. Now, gambesons, as Shad and Todd call the armor, could be made in a variety of fashions and over the course of history have been really confused with a lot of other terms for very similar padded armor. These different types can be known also as Agaddons, padded jackets, pourpoints, and arming doublets. They all basically serve the same function, though to specifically be called a gambeson back in the day, it really needed to be a lot thicker than an Agaddon and was sometimes decorated with heraldry and used specifically for external wear. Basically, back in the day, if you wanted more protection than a thin little Agaddon and weren't able to afford mail armor or plate armor to really help protect you, you could essentially just keep adding more and more layers of linen and wool until you walked around as a mostly impenetrable giant marshmallow. But if you were in the position to acquire mail armor and plate armor, like the Great Slayer here, the 2-layer Agaddon would have absolutely been your choice of underpadding to protect the parts of the body that were too awkward to cover with hard, inflexible materials like your armpit, as well as cushion the body underneath all those really painful metal plates. As a final note on this, the Slayer's Agaddon appears to be a bit more of a leathery material, which we can confirm here on the entry on ArtStation by Doom 2016 character art director Jason Martin. The Slayer has leather underneath all the layers of the Praetor suit going down to his ankles and looks like a more modern stitch compared to the padding in the Dark Ages. It looks really awesome, but leather would have never really been used in this fashion in the Middle Ages because at the time they didn't really have the techniques yet in order to make it really soft and flexible. What they had more often though that was actually used in leather armor was called rawhide, which was a technique where they took the hide of the animal and made it really rigid and solid, which is actually what we can see here on the Slayer's skirt in the front. Another great video I found that actually goes into more detail about the history of leather armor can be found here on Schologram's channel. Also, if Argent Society did manage to develop some sort of like leather underpadding that had as much usefulness as an Agaddon, the Great Slayer would have just sweat to death and like died of heat stroke by the time he even made it to the battlefield. Next up, let's take a look at the final and most important part of his whole getup, which is the plate armor. Here we can see a fantastic blend of Doom 64's Marine uniform and the 2016 and Eternal Praetor suits, which have been melted together with medieval elements into my absolute favorite version of his armor. We've got his exposed biceps, the washboard abs, his hip pockets, the glass visor helmet, absolutely oversized boots, gauntlets, and new fantastic pauldrons, now sporting a set of Bowser shell spikes.
Absolutely spectacular designs, spared no expense.
As far as it being medieval though, it's definitely a blend of multiple eras and designs, which quickly came and went over the course of the Middle Ages as fashion and warfare changed. But we definitely have some telltale signs for armor of the period here. Doomguy is wearing what is called articulated plate armor, a harness of plate armor made of individual elements for each limb. Each element consists of lames, or strips of metal, and plates, linked together by movable rivets and leather straps, giving the body a full range of motion without any impairment due to the rigidity of the material. So to wrap up, our Great Slayer dons an incredible and intimidating grofell reminiscent of old Viking kings, has a under-padding protection called an Agaddon and costly mail on top of that, and his plate armor is a fusion of new and old, giving him the best protection of the era while keeping full mobility to destroy any enemy in his wake. Now last in the scene, we see the brand new design for the shotgun as well as the brand new weapon, the shield saw. I'm going to leave the shotgun to other people on YouTube because I don't really have a lot of expertise on guns, especially old historic double-barreled flintlock pistols, but they did exist and were really intricate, just like the one the Doomguy Slayer has. The Doomguy Slayer. Just like Doomguy has, and we can actually see this here in this old French pistol from 1752. So instead, let's take a crack at the shield saw. It's probably one of the coolest and most anticipated weapons in the game, and is a pretty straightforward item to talk about historically. Round shields have existed for a long time, both large and small, and it'd be pretty tough to pick out exactly which one the shield saw is based on. The shield saw that we have in the game has a modified leather gripping handle, which obviously most shields need, but historically it would have been a bit more of a strap and usually made of leather, which were called en-arms, and they can be seen here on this incredible Bayeux tapestry depicting the Battle of Hastings in 1066. But our shield has an extra handle, specifically a crank handle. It also has an extremely powerful magnet that can be released and recalled on command without somehow killing the wearer, so let's just employ suspension of disbelief on this one and enjoy its ridiculous effectiveness on the battlefield. As a final note on Doomguy before we move on to the rest of the trailer, we can see his face model here just after he crash lands. His visor is a more frosted glass than Eternal, but we can barely make out a blink and a look up to the left. His face seems to have smoothed over a bit more along with everything else in the game, with fewer noticeable polygons, and he seems a bit more realistically proportioned. Alex over here at Digital Foundry has a really great video covering the potential power increases in the id Tech game engine from the days of Doom Eternal, and I'm really excited to see how well the game actually performs and how good the graphics will look on release compared to older entries. Let's get out of the history books officially and into the action, where just after the Slayer crash lands, we can see our first look at the new imp design. We can see the fire that gets launched from his palms visible as a glow between separated tendons on his forearms, along with glowing talons, and he's rocking a bony exoskeleton with horns protruding from various parts of his body. Later on, we can see the imp 2 more times in full body view, but not with as much definition, though we can make out a distinct hole in his palm where fireballs emanate from, as well as a cool green electric magic attack he's wizarding up with his claws. Overall, the design is very menacing and rough compared to Doom Eternal's, and I think it really adds to the gritty Game of Thrones feeling we're getting from the rest of the trailer. Next up, let's talk about the Skull Crusher we mentioned earlier. I skipped over the scene with the Mancubus because I found I didn't really have anything additional to add here, besides the fact that there's a Sentinel ship in the background who is having a very bad day. The first thing I noticed about this weapon, apart from its fantastic crowd control buckshot capabilities, is the fact that his skull stays oddly together under the weight of the gun's many hydraulic presses. I'm assuming that animating it all into the separate parts to show the cranial and facial bones probably would have killed the animators and caused dropped frames, but it does give us a really great opportunity to look at this symbol on the top of each one of their heads. It's a pretty easy guess that we're using the skulls of our enemies as ammo, but we can actually confirm it here in part 6 of the History of the Sentinels. This story relays when the priests of the Order Dea conducted research to find an advantage against the demons in battle, leading to the discovery of the essence in the Dark Realm and demonic energy, and as well in Fuel the Eternal Flame Part 3 from the Korax tablets. We see the symbol again next to a depiction of the final step of the demon making and soul extracting process. The symbol appears also throughout all the other pages of the History of the Sentinels, where we can actually see a visual representation of the demon's energy being blended with Maker technology and Wraith energy by combining the demon symbols with Maker style symbols. This makes a lot of sense, as in a much more obvious location, we can actually see this symbol on a very large scale on the floor of Ingmor's sanctum. In the Ancient Gods, the Father and the Dark Lord's life spheres are held here, and it's also where Doomguy is eventually laid to rest once again at the end of the campaign. So I'm thinking this symbol could pretty safely be construed as representing the Dark Lord himself. Also, you can find it here on ArtStation, with all the other demonic runes and writings by art director Emerson Tung. Overall, I think is a really great and creepy detail, imagining that in the process of becoming a demon, not only do you get tortured into absolute madness, get the soul sucked out of you for Argent energy, and your metaphysical existence replaced by the dark essence, but you also get a nice little boop to the forehead with a branding iron on your way out the door to say, yep, this one's fully baked, on the next demon. Also, going back to what we were talking about earlier with ammo in the game, I think it would actually be really fun if they made it that the only way you can reload your clip for this gun is by actually killing demons. The more murder you do, the more ammo you have for the Skull Crusher to fire at more enemies to give you more skulls. As far as practicality goes, testing the efficacy of this weapon by buying a human skull, breaking up and fracturing its remains, and then firing it at a wall and then measuring the impact really isn't in my wheelhouse. But man, what I wouldn't pay to actually see a Mythbusters episode of that. But I did read a ton of papers that all made my brain hurt, and came up with a decent theory, I think, about how the gun would perform in real life. So, bones have been used throughout human history, obviously, as tools, but not really so much as weapons because they're pretty brittle. While an intact bone can withstand pressure when the pressure is applied gradually, which is what the human body was designed for, impacts, even more gentle ones, can cause fracturing and failures the faster speed at which the impact occurs. Now, mandibles, which are our jawbones, were a very popular choice of use for historical tools because they have lower levels of marrow and stay together a little better, but even those are susceptible to fast impacts. All this in mind, I think the bone coming out of the gun would probably shatter on impact or shatter right out of the barrel. Though being on the receiving end of this thing would absolutely stop you in your tracks like it does here with the demons, because it would basically be like getting a giant blast of sand in your face with bits of razor-sharp seashell bits thrown into the mix. Though none of that really matters because it looks awesome, and I think it's going to be super fun in gameplay. I think we're all going to have a blast playing it. Next up is number 8, finger trees. These trees are very cool and very creepy, and they remind me a lot of the pneumatours mangroves have, which are like those exposed root systems that help them breathe when most of the rest of the plant is underwater. Which is an interesting environmental suggestion, but we'll delve a little bit more into the environment later on in the trailer. More in line with the lore and Doom, I think this could be a really cool potential callback to the Ancestrals of Argent. Described in the History of the Sentinels Part 1, they were awoken by the Wraith Call, and were feral creatures invigorated by the magic of the Wraiths. They grew to enormous heights, mighty behemoths who waged war with each other for years untold. Their battles tore the land asunder and destroyed all creation in their wake. After their defeat by the Argenta leading to the time of man, they either died or were forced back into the crevices and remote valleys of the planet. So these really creepy finger trees could be the fallen remains of these titans, with these large plants and trees growing out of their deceased bodies. And now, moving on to the more pertinent part of this scene, we have the Reaper, or the Revenant version 1.0. And I do think it is a Revenant, as the cannons on its back is an obvious giveaway, and if we zoom in nice and uncomfortably close here on the pixels, we can see his signature lipless grin. And this version of him is a little creepier to me than past versions, except for maybe Doom 2016's, mainly because he's wearing a helmet that completely covers his eyes with no discernible eye holes, which is very Malenia.
Blade of Mikola.
Now let's take a look at his helmet design along with the other helmets we've seen the demons wearing throughout the trailer. They look to be mainly inspired by Sillets. Similar to how there were tons of round shields throughout history, there is also a ton of variation on the theme for Sillets depending on what country you look at during the Middle Ages. But they all retain the basic concept of being flared out in the back to protect the neck and coming down in front to protect the eyes. Oftentimes back in the day, these helmets would have a visor attached to them that you could move up and down so you could switch between having your eyes protected or actually just being able to see what the hell was going on. Some stopped at the brow line, while others just had tiny eye slots carved out of them, which is what our demon spawn appears to be sporting. Though as we can see here, some creative liberties were taken by the developers, adding on these spyglass red eyeballs. Some Sillets also came with these things called bevers, which protected your neck and chin, letting you walk around looking like an antique trash can, until they eventually evolved into the closed helm we think of today when imagining medieval armor. As for the Revenant sickle sword, I found that this is really just kind of for aesthetic purposes, giving him a really great Grim Reaper vibe, which is then added onto by the fact that he just glides towards the player motionless while he fires his cannons at you. It's very unsettling. Also, I really love this tiny detail that when he launches off the ground, you can see a faint orange glow from his thrusters and leaves and vegetation flying up all around him. There's a lot of graphical details like this that we can see throughout the trailer that really add a nice touch to this new version of the game. After annihilating the Reaper with one hit, we now get to pan the camera over to point number 10, which is our next victim. This little dude is firing obnoxiously bright beams of light at us from a demon longbow, which has a pretty cool design to it, with an accentuated riser and glowing limbs. The beams of light being shot out of the bow have an interesting element to them, namely this green one here. We can see a green light later in the trailer that's similar to this with the Hell Knight when the Doom guy rings his bell with the shield saw. I think this green light might be an indication of a parry system, where when this green energy appears, you can use the shield saw to absorb the attack and reflect it back at the enemy. Looking down at the creature the demon is riding, we have this game's counterpart to the Pinky. I think the interaction for this rider and mount is going to be pretty obvious in gameplay. From a distance, we're going to get our health chipped away at from the rider's bow, and if we get too close, we'll get decimated by the Pinky ramming us with his skull, which is going to be super fun, and by super fun, I mean very obnoxious. But for trailer demonstration purposes, the Pinky stands firmly still, and we get a swing at the rider, knocking him out of a weirdly modern western saddle that has a large square skirt, high cantle, and long gripping horn. It's just missing the stirrups, but overall it actually looks like it'd be a pretty comfortable ride. Now, most saddles in the medieval period didn't have this design, and instead had no horn and featured a raised pommel that often matched the height of the cantle, intended to protect the rider and keep them snugly in place with all their armor on. But having a more modern saddle with a horn actually works in this guy's case, as the style allows for a more comfortable seat when the demon rider is using both hands to fire his bow at the slayer, and it gives him something to try to hold on to when he starts getting tossed around rodeo style off its back. Also, for those of you that ever wanted to see what a demon's foot looks like, there you go. Next up for number 11, we have this fantastic chasm where we face the new version of the Arachnotron and some creepy floating brains off in the distance that I don't think are here for our autograph. I mainly wanted to talk about this section for its incredible environment and storytelling details. From recently wet kelp spewing over the nearby rocks, to the dolomite limestone cliffs that once held ocean water, to the actual just boat sitting wrecked in the middle of the frame, it really makes an example of how the war plaguing Argent d'Nor and previous immense natural disasters throughout its history have shaped the landscape. It's a pretty ridiculous suggestion that in the midst of all this chaos, an entire channel of brackish water managed to be completely drained. Also, in the middle of this recently drained area, we have a very prominent statue sitting on the bottom of the seafloor. And if we look closely, it appears to be none other than a seraphim, with eyes going down its robe matching those that we see in the World Spear in the Ancient Gods Part 2. He also appears to be holding some sort of large sharp spear or staff of some kind in his right hand. We can see holograms of seraphims at the altar containing the Wraith Crystal we retrieve inside the World Spear, which is interesting because in the Codex entry for the Crystal and the Gatekeepers, it doesn't really mention the seraphims being there at all. So I'm going to theorize here that between their presence in holograph form here at the altar, and in the existence of this statue, the game will probably take place well after the portrayal of Valen, when he gave the priest of the Order Dag the keys to the Sepulchre of Elements, giving them access to the Wraiths. In this next scene, we have point number 12, where Doomguy is letting his shield saw absolutely rip through hordes of demons as it boomerangs around the playing field. As others online have noticed, we can see that when the collision of the shield saw hits enemies, for a few frames the enemy model disappears, replacing the intact enemy with a torn in half enemy. Now, I can't speak to ID's collision detection system or how their id tech engine works, but I fully expect this and other small details to be smoothed out before the game's official release. I'm glad we kind of got to see it though. It shows a really cool little snippet into how the game's magic works and is kind of fun to watch. Taking a look past these soldiers into the background for point number 13, we have a tree that has a spinal column, and I hate it. Also, there's an interesting symbol here on one of its branches, which is probably nothing, despite the fact that it looks exactly like the symbol on the Hellguards from 2016, which were parasites housed in bone and keratin exoskeletons and infused with incredible amounts of hell energy. I'm sure this tree isn't the dormant exoskeleton of one of these guards that's going to come out and try to destroy us when we get up too close to it, guarding the Hellgate in the background, but we'll see. Speaking of gates though, let's look past the glitchy enemies and the spine tree and take a look at this gate in the background for point number 14. This really isn't a detail as much as an observation of, hey, we're in hell, from looking at the architecture to the gargoyles to the bones scattered around the landscape and the giant lava gate spewing molten death from the eyes of a horned monstrosity. But this does get me thinking about what exactly this level could be. During the Slayer's time on Argent d'Nor, he mainly just fought on the planet, going through the unholy wars and the civil war between those loyal to the Wraiths and those loyal to the Makers. The only time the Codex has mentioned the Slayer going back into hell after arriving in Argent d'Nor is here in the Slayer's Testament from Doom 2016 and in part 13 of the History of the Sentinels in Doom Eternal. These entries recount the betrayal of the priest that stranded Doomguy in hell alone and his journey thereafter, which leads him to become known by the demons as the Hellwalker and the Doomslayer. By looking at these codexes and the experience the Doomslayer goes through, we might actually have a pretty good look at the different mission sets that we might experience in the game. These could include crushing the obsidian pillars from the Blood Temple, destroying the beasts of the Nine Circles, finding the wretch who shall not be named, defeating the Titan the Great One, and eventually journeying into the Blood Keep, where he's eventually trapped in a sarcophagus that he stays in until we're eventually woken up in Doom 2016. I'm gonna be really interested to see how true id Software decides to stay to these old codex entries, expanding upon Doomguy's journey of loss and betrayal through Argent d'Nor and the desolate plains of Hell. The trailer then brings us to our next location, as grand doors slide open, revealing intricate pavement, sentinel torches, and a grand landscape marred with the fresh wounds of battle. I'd like to draw your attention first to something way in the background, past the enemy posts, the Mancubus on our left, the demons fighting our way to get to us in front, and past this new enemy, which we'll talk about soon, until we arrive on the left side of this bridge where we can see detail number 15. Two factions are pitted against each other and charging towards the middle of the towering pathway. There appears to be a squad of firearm-wielding sentinel soldiers advancing towards an opposing group, which if I'm looking at the pixels correctly, I'm guessing is a flock of demons, due to their extremely scattered formation and distorted forms. A similar situation can be seen on the right side of the bridge. This, along with the marching troops of demons we saw earlier in the trailer, really gives me a lot of hope that this warring state demonstrated in gameplay will be something tangible, something we can actually interact with. Rather than it being set decor, I'd love to see the Doomslayer completing rescue missions, fighting alongside his Sentinel brethren in pre-designed battle levels, or maybe giving the player a slightly more open-world experience where you can randomly stumble across a battle where any Night Sentinels you manage to save gets to join alongside you for the rest of that mission, assisting you in quelling the hordes of demons that we'll be facing throughout this new installment. And I'd really like to see an intuitive AI system that swarms the Doomslayer as enemies, backs them up as allies, and makes you truly feel surrounded in this battles for survival. Rewinding the tape a little bit for point number 16, we now get to look at this new weapon called the Flail. Now, flails did exist in history, but not quite in the giant scale we see here and in other modern fantasy takes. The flails I could actually find from the Middle Ages were much tinier and nowhere near as intimidating, but I'm sure if they were used in combat regardless of their size, it would absolutely suck to be on the receiving end of one. The physics-defying speed Doomguy is able to whip this flail at his enemy is very satisfying, and it appears as though when used on higher level enemies, it simply acts as a stagger alongside his kick, canceling this enemy's attack animation, while when used on the rider from earlier, a presumably lower level enemy, it just takes them out completely. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this vital dual melee counterattack is actually going to be when creating our new move combinations, and how much it'll actually help us defeat the enemies in front of us. I can imagine creating a whole new balancing system wasn't an easy task, and the developers had a lot of work in front of them in order to make this an enjoyable experience. Either way, it really lends to the feeling I think the developers wanted, which is that Doomguy is just an immovable wall of pain to any enemy that goes in his way. And now let's acknowledge the enemy on the receiving end of this flail for point number 17. He's one of the only enemies we see not get blown to pieces on the first shot, and he's also donning the same Grofell cape that the Slayer is. There's many theories that this enemy is version 1.0 of the Doom Hunter from Eternal, which from my research actually sounds like a pretty definitive connection, with the priest Dea Granach straight up giving us the name of this old enemy, as well as the region of Argent d'Nor that Doom the Dark Ages might take place in.
The great Agaddon Hunters from the Telos realm, though long thought to be extinct, created to hunt only the Slayer and his Night Sentinels during the Unholy Crusades.
The Codex entry for the Doom Hunter goes on to say that they were once a race of beast-like hunters known to Sentinel warriors in ages past as lethal stalkers of the Metal Age. But I'd like to expand on this thought a little more by pointing out various elements in his design. Starting with his arm and face cover, these are made out of hammered metal plates that are painted a burnt red and glowing yellow-orange with evil energy, nearly identical to the Dark Lord's. And the glowing circles on the enemy's new elbow hinge and glowing chest emblem aren't just yellow glowy spots, they're more of a flat yellow with what looks like a slitted pupil in the middle. The only other time we've seen these eyes is in the Titan MacLeod, who guards Ingmor's Sanctum and the Father and the Dark Lord's life spheres, the Icon of Sin, and the Makers themselves. Gameplay-wise, the situation doesn't really get any better, as this new demon honestly just reminds me of the Gladiator from Sentinel Prime. Now, the Gladiator's origins are placed just at the end of the Golden Age, when the factions of Argent d'Nor turned against one another, and the priests broke Sentinel law, caging this demon in the Colosseum as a merciless executioner, which I believe is just after when the Doom the Dark Ages story will end. Both of these guys bear a striking resemblance to each other, with their minimal Roman gladiator armor, intelligent and intentional movement set, and weapon combinations, along with their horns, yellow eyes, and incredible stature. Also, isn't it interesting that our medieval Doomslayer was given similar equipment and attire to both both of these demons. The cape, the flail, the shield, the chest emblem, though this chest emblem's overall design is a little closer to the tyrant than the sentinel armor. What I'm getting at is I think this new enemy was tailor-made and cherry-picked by the priests or the makers themselves. He's not just another random demon hellspawn, he looks too intentional for that. Between his resilience to the Slayer's attacks and uncanny resemblance to other formidable forces, he most likely is going to be this game's enemy replacement for the Marauders. I think anything less and it just wouldn't do this guy's design justice. And speaking of titans, let's move on to point number 18, where we can see the Slayer piloting his very own Atlan, and probably the one we see wrecked later in the Doom Fortress in Eternal. Even from a distance, this titan is a great example of the increase in graphical detail that Doom the Dark Ages boasts compared to older entries in the series. Now, titans are known for their ability to live through basically anything and keep fighting despite ungodly amounts of injuries, and only eventually are brought down by Atlan weaponry or the Crucible Blade. But now we have a better idea of what's going on anatomically here from the artists, and from what I'm looking at, this guy really shouldn't be able to move at all, as he's currently suffering from anterior sternoclavicular dislocation of both of his collarbones. A dislocation like this would really only occur from an extremely traumatic injury to the side of the body, rupturing the anterior capsule and destroying all the ligaments that keep it connected to his sternum. A dislocation like this would really only occur from an extremely traumatic injury to the side of the body, and only represents 1% of joint dislocations in humans, though we have to take into account this guy's size and scale, and his altercations with the Great Slayer. The Titan could have easily acquired these injuries in battle, or by simply falling over, causing his full body weight to compress his shoulder and pop the clavicle out of place, breaking his anterior capsule and ripping all the ligaments. He's an extra special case though, as not only are the bones dislocated, but the ripped ligaments are just missing entirely. So theoretically, the range of motion in his shoulder and his ability to use his arms at all should be greatly reduced, and causing him significant amounts of pain by putting strains on all of his other muscles in his back. Additionally, if these bones were to flex inwards towards his neck at any point due to not being anchored to the sternum, it could lead to compression and damage of his trachea, esophagus, nerves, and blood vessels. And yet he still stands, which is incredibly vexing, but it's going to make for an absolutely epic fight, which I hope we get to see. I hope that these fights with the Titan aren't just scripted, like little events that we get to watch play out, and we actually get to delve into beating this guy in hand-to-hand combat. And now we're on to one of the last details I wanted to talk about in the trailer, and one of my favorites, point number 19, our dragon buddy. He's got cool mechanical wings, a nasty attitude, and is really, really big. I'd first like to focus on his helmet, where we can see that it appears he's blind in his left eye, accompanied by a distinct cut in his face shield on the right, leaving only his glowing red right eye to look upon the Slayer. As far as the design goes, we've already looked at combat helmets of the medieval period, which this guy definitely seems to be inspired by, but I don't think is quite the right fit for our dragon. Most of the time, you couldn't see out of a medieval helmet to save your life. Literally. Most soldiers, when they got off their horses, would take the helmet off completely, or at least move the visor up if it had a movable visor, in order to see what the hell was going on. Having unprotected eyes or head was better than not being able to see the axe coming at you at all. So instead, I'd like to propose a different point of reference for our new winged friend's helmet, which are Inuit snow goggles. With their long, narrow slits, they have historically been made from wood or bone and greatly reduce the glare reflecting off snow in the northern reaches of the world. A very important thing to have, as said glare can cause snow blindness, a painful condition that damages the cornea due to overexposure to UV radiation from the sun itself, along with the snow reflecting that up again at your eye off the ground. These goggles have a surprisingly wide field of view, and according to anthropologist Anne Fina Riordan, the slits act like a pinhole, focusing the light that hits your eye and increasing visual acuity, basically giving you better vision. It makes faraway objects appear clearer and sharper, and have been reported to act like prescription sunglasses, enhancing your ability to see your surroundings and its details. Both of these functions would be a great help to the war-based flying creature that needs optimized sight and protection from presumably a lot of light from flames, laser gunfire, and the sun, and the ability to spot both prey and foe. So overall, I think this helmet is a great addition to our dragon's armory, as it protects its skull from potential trauma to the frontal bone, enhances its presumably already eagle-like eyesight, and shields its eyes, or eye, from extremely bright lights, and looks absolutely terrifying. What's more terrifying to me personally though, and the only thing I can see when I look at him, is his human teeth. Unlike the dragon featured in the World Spear in the Ancient Gods Part 2, this new creature boasts 32 teeth with 16 on top and 16 on bottom, which is the max a human can have when you have all 4 wisdom teeth in place. And it only has a slight variation on human chompers, as its canines are moved back a space instead of between the incisors and the premolars. Visually uncanny and seemingly illogical for a dragon, these teeth probably serve less of the functions stereotypically associated with dragons, and more bone and armor crushing. An Earth-based counterpart to this molar setup enforces this idea with the existence of the deeply disturbing sheepshead fish. The teeth in this fish are tailor-made to break through the hard shells of mollusks, crustaceans, and similar organisms that make up its preferred diet. Our teeth as humans are also nothing to sneeze at for ability, as some humans can have bite forces north of 200 pounds or 90 kilograms. And our teeth are similar in strength and composition makeup to the teeth of sharks, though our teeth are made more for tearing and crushing rather than sawing. So combining all of that knowledge from the teeth to the helmet and applying it on a significantly larger scale to this magnificently creepy creature, we can safely assume that the Slayer's new partner is well equipped for all manner of skull-crushing, limb-tearing, and demon-spawning annihilation. Also, unlike the dragon in the World Spear, it doesn't really look like Doomguy is riding the dragon anywhere in the new trailer. So he looks awesome, but is he going to be like remote control, or is he just going to be like a glorified fast travel system? I'd really love to have a flushed out system where we can take off, land, fly to remote locations to access secrets, and investigate different parts of the map, since Doomguy isn't going to be as jumpy and flighty in this version. And maybe even do battle on the back of the dragon, using his fire breath as crowd control. He's got a lot of potential as a gameplay mechanic, and considering how much screen time the developers gave him in the trailer, I have pretty high expectations of how we're going to be able to experience him in the game. As our final note for detail number 20 in this trailer, I just wanted to point out the fact that the Titans have fingers coming out of their jaws, which I didn't notice before. They were there if you look closely. It's just now that we have all this high definition going on, I finally noticed it, and I just wanted to point it out because I hate it. So, thank you so much for staying until the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this absolutely ridiculous amount of research, and let me know what you guys thought of all of my takes and if I missed any other fun, minute details. I'm really excited for the Dark Ages to come out next year, and in the meantime, feel free to stick around and watch my playthrough of Doom Eternal. I'm planning on diving into the DLC soon, as well as Doom 2016, or check out some of my cozier content, where I've been playing Animal Crossing on the GameCube and doing some relaxing gameplay. Until then, I hope you all are happy and healthy, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!